In this demonstration, you're going to learn some of the basics of editing in ArcGIS Pro. All right, so we're going to start from the perspective of a project that I've already got loaded. You can see that for this particular map, I have several different layers, including creeks and streams, lakes and ponds, city limits, parcels, and my base map layer. And so that's kind of the data sets that we'll be working with here. Now, the first thing we'll go over are some of the project options related to editing in ArcGIS Pro. And so I'm going to switch over to the Project tab and go to Options. And you'll see under Application Level Options, there's an Editing tab. And I've got several different options here for editing. We're not going to go through every option here. I'm just going to highlight some of the new additions here and some things that you may want to take a look at in terms of options for ArcGIS Pro. Now, the other thing I'll mention right off the bat is that the workflow for editing in ArcGIS Pro has changed substantially from ArcMap. In ArcMap, the editing process required that you create an edit session on a workspace to get started with the editing process, and then you would make your edits to that workspace. And a workspace basically is just a container for data. So it might be a folder if you're dealing with shapefiles, or a geodatabase, right? File, ArcSDE geodatabases if you're working in a geodatabase environment. But regardless, when you start an edit session, you start an edit session on one workspace at a time. And you do your edits, and then at the end, you stop the edit session, and you can save or discard your changes as needed there. Now, in ArcGIS Pro, that concept of edit session goes away. So editing is essentially turned on at all times. It's going to be up to the end user to define what layers are going to be editable and to initiate edits as needed. There is a permission structure in place that will ensure that you're not able to edit layers or tables that you don't have permissions to edit on. But assuming that you have permissions, you should be able to edit any layer at any time, and you're not limited to a single workspace either. Right? But that whole concept of edit sessions goes away. So the first thing we'll take a look at here is going under Session. One big new addition into ArcGIS Pro in terms of options is this option for automatically saving edits. Right? And it is turned off by default, so you do have to come in here and turn this on. And what this does is the default here is going to be just automatically save edits on a specific time interval of 10 minutes. So what this is going to do is basically you're essentially allowing ArcGIS Pro to automatically save any edits at a specific time interval of every 10 minutes. And so this is independent of any manual saves that you may do in addition to that. Right? This is just saying that, hey, every 10 minutes I'm going to make an auto save of my edits. This is, you can configure this to whatever value you want. It just defaults to 10, but you can make that larger or smaller as needed. The other option for automatically saving edits is number of operations. So if you don't want to do it based on time interval, you can do this on number of operations. And then once you reach the threshold of the number of operations, 30 being the default, once it reaches that threshold, then an auto save takes place. So that is a new option with ArcGIS Pro. In general, it can be a good thing, but you do have to keep in mind that as you're making edits, ArcGIS Pro is building up an edit stack, right? So a stack of all the edits that you've made. And you have that ability to undo edits as needed, but you can only undo edits back to the last time that a save took place. So this can cause some issues, right? You just have to keep in mind that if you are auto-saving, that edit stack is periodically going to be wiped out. And if you find yourself in a situation where you need to undo an edit, but you've already reached that time interval, then you're not going to have an option of undoing that edit. So you'd have to either restore from a backup or manually undo those edits. So it's just something to keep in mind. All right, other things here, there's checkboxes here for saving edits when saving a project. Right? A lot of people don't realize that those are independent operations. Just because you're saving a project doesn't mean you're also saving your edits, if you are in fact making edits to your data. So if you check this on, then what you're doing is you're enforcing that anytime you save the project, it's also going to save any edits that you may have made. Checkboxes here are turned on for show dialog for saving and confirming, or saving and discarding. It's just a confirmation box. You probably want to leave those turned on. The last checkbox here, make newly added layers editable by default. Right? What we're doing here is anytime you add a new layer, into your maps, those automatically become editable as needed. Of course, you can turn that off if you want to manually. Right, and then again, there are other options here. I'm not going to go through everything. Just going to hit some of the highlights here. Under General, a lot of different options under General. Again, I'm not going to go through all of these. One interesting one is this one at the bottom, the Show Editing Toolbar on the map. I'm going to come back to this to show you exactly what we're referring to. But anytime you're editing in ArcGIS Pro, there's an editing toolbar that is visible on the map, and you can hide and show it. You can resize it, reposition it as needed. But I will come back to this at a later time so you get a better feel for this. There's an option here for touchscreen input for new features. If you have a touchscreen and you want to turn that on, there's a checkbox for touchscreen input. Dialog boxes for confirming deletion of data. You probably want to leave that turned on. Enable vertex editing when sketching. Probably want to leave that turned on. There's enable double clicking as a shortcut for the finish button. Typically want to leave that turned on. And there's other things here as well, obviously. Right? Just want to spend a little bit of time going through this. If you don't understand what some of these options are, right, you may want to spend a little bit of time getting more familiar with some of these options, because there are quite a few of them. There's also options here for annotation. If you're doing feature-linked annotation, there's some options for that, as well as for symbology, so you can control the color of vertices, either selected or unselected, and you can control various size operations for your vertices and your segments. So just some different options there. A lot of these you probably won't really need to make changes to, but I just wanted to make you aware of those real quick before we get going. And again, those were under project options. So I'll go back to the main interface at this point. Next thing we want to touch on is editing as it relates to the contents pane. In the contents pane in ArcGIS Pro, there is a new list by editing button. And if you click on that, what it'll do is it'll present you with a list of all the layers that have been added to the current map. And this is where you, as the end user, define what layers are going to be editable, what layers are not going to be editable. Because remember, we no longer have this concept of edit session, so it's going to be up to you as the end user to define what layers you want to edit and when you want to edit them. So for this particular example, maybe I just want to edit parcels, and so I'll leave that one checked on, check everything else off. And so all I'm doing here is just basically ensuring that the only layer that I'm going to edit is going to be the parcel layer for this particular example. Now, if a layer is not editable for one reason or another, you will see this little red exclamation point. If you mouse over it, it'll give you more information about why the layer is not editable. In this case, it's a base map layer, so it's not in a format that would be editable. But the rest of these layers kind of goes back to permissions, right? So, assuming that you have permissions to edit a layer, then it should be all clear. But if you don't have permissions to edit a layer, you will see a little red exclamation point out to the right-hand side of the layer. And if you mouse over it, it'll basically tell you, hey, you don't have permissions to edit this layer. Now, there's also a list by snapping button that kind of goes hand in hand with editing. This also is just a list of layers, and you can use the checkboxes to define, again, what layers you want to be able to snap to and what layers you don't want to snap to. So in this case, because we're working with parcels, I'm going to limit my snapping to the parcel layer. So what this does is it effectively ensures that as I'm adding new parcels to my data set, or I'm updating parcels, it ensures that I have the ability to snap to an existing parcel so that I don't get an overlap situation or underlap situation. With parcels in general, you don't want gaps between those parcels. So in this case, it would make sure that I'm snapping to an adjacent parcel as I'm going through that editing process. All right, so those are the two main buttons on the contents pane that you need to be familiar with as it relates to editing. And now we'll switch over to the Edit tab. So on the ribbon for ArcGIS Pro, there's an Edit tab. If you click on that, that initiates a lot of the functionality that will allow you to edit your data set. So we'll kind of work our way left to right and just kind of describe what you're seeing here. Far left-hand side is your clipboard. This allows you to cut, copy, and paste. This is handy for example, copying features from one layer to another. It often comes into play when you have data stored in a CAD data set and you're wanting to migrate some of that data to a GIS format. So you might copy some of the features that are in a CAD layer and then paste them into your GIS layer. Under Manage Edits, you have Save and Discard buttons. These are your manual save and discard. You'll notice that right now they're grayed out. Those become activated as soon as you make at least one edit. So as soon as you start making edits, those will become active, allowing you to manually save or discard your changes. Keep in mind, this is a manual save, so this is independent of any auto-saving that you may be doing. So you can certainly save in between the auto-saves if you do have that auto-saving turned on. I'm not going to go into much detail on the topology button here, but you're allowed to initiate map topology from the editor tab, and there's some tools here for allowing you to check the status and get a report of any errors that for features that are violating any of your geodatabase topology rules that you may have set. The snapping button, this is a multi-function button. The topmost part of this button is just a toggle button that allows you to turn snapping on or off. If it has a gray background, it's turned off, but if you click it, notice it turns it blue. What you've done there is you've turned snapping on at that point. Now the lower part of this button displays a pane that allows you to configure various types of snapping. The topmost part of this is just a toggle button that allows you to turn snapping on or off, which is the same thing as clicking the topmost part of the button. And then just below that, you have a row of specific types of snapping. So snapping to the nearest point, snapping to an endpoint, snapping to a vertex, snap to the nearest edge of a polyline or polygon. So these are just independent niche types of snapping, right? And they work the same way. If they have a blue background and you've clicked them, that means you've turned that type of snapping on. I'll just leave all these turned on for this example just to make things simpler. And you can also set the snapping tolerance here by drawing a circle. That just allows you to define the kind of almost like a buffer distance within which if you get inside that buffer distance, it's going to snap to an existing feature. And then under snapping settings, you can also set the XY tolerance here. The default's going to be 10 pixels. A few other things you can set here. Typically, though, you're going in here and changing that XY tolerance. The next set of tools, create, modify, and delete. These are the tools that you use to initiate the creation of new features, the modification of existing features, or the deletion of existing features. I'll come back to that in just a few moments. Selection tools, these allow you to create manual selections for the purposes of either modifying or deleting features. You can also view the attributes pane for any selected features, clear your selection set. Under tools, this is a gallery of commonly used editing tools. This is configurable and customizable by you. This is, the default is just what Esri assigns as common editing tools, but you'll notice at the bottom here there's a customize option, and that allows you to go in here and customize your tools. So you can add and remove groups, you can change the ordering of groups, you can add and remove tools, reorder those tools. Really, you can customize this set of commonly used editing tools to suit your needs. The tools to the right of that I'm not going to cover here. There's some elevation tools for doing three-dimensional feature edits, and there's also the data reviewer button, but that's a separate license extension, so I'm not going to cover anything on that side. What I want to do now is kind of take you through the process of creating new features right now. So in terms of creating new features right now, the only layer that I have turned on for creation or editing is the parcel layer. So when I click on the create button, what that's going to do is it's going to initiate a new pane called the create features pane. And it'll show up on the right hand side of your screen. Now, in order for a layer to show up on the create features pane, there are two conditions that have to be met. A layer has to be both visible and it has to be marked as editable. So that goes back to your contents pane. You can tell what layers have been marked as visible by going to list by drawing order, and all you're looking for here is a check next to your layer here. Now parcels has been checked on, so it is visible and it is marked as editable. Right? So that's the only layer that's going to show up on that create features pane right now. And the reason for that is of course because that layer has met those two conditions. It's editable and it's visible. Now, if we click on something like city limits, you might initially think that the city limits layer should show up here as well. So, but that goes back to our initial two conditions, right? City limits has been turned on from an editing perspective, but it's not visible, right? If you go back to list by data source, you'll notice that it's not turned on for visibility. But the moment I turn it on, now it meets both conditions, right? And so now you'll notice that the city limits layer has been added to that create features pane. So layers have to be visible and editable in order for them to show up on this pane. Right now, we're just going to focus on parcels. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit here, and what we're going to do is just add in a new feature. Out of this corner. So the idea here is we're just going to add in a new parcel. I mean, it doesn't really matter where we put it, but we'll kind of walk through this process of creating a new feature. So on that Create Features pane, if you click the layer, it'll drop down a set of tools that you can use. These are sketch tools that you can use to essentially draw the new feature. One of these will be the default, and that's going to be the one that has a rectangle around it, which is just a polygon tool. But what you have here is a set of polygon tools, right, that allow you to define different ways of drawing in this case, a polygon. You'll see different tools depending upon the data type. So if it's a line feature class or a point feature class, you'll see a different set of tools here. I'm just going to use the default construction tool here of polygon. Now you'll notice that when I initiated that, I also got a little toolbar that shows up on top of my map. Right? And this toolbar, you may or may not want it, right? So some people, and personally, I find it to be a little bit obtrusive, so I tend to turn this off. But other people use it pretty extensively. This goes back to those project options that I was talking about earlier. So I'm going to go back to project options, and you can, before I do that, just you have a set of tools here that allows you to draw in features as well. Right? So it's just another set of tools that you can use. But if I go back to project options, go back to editing. General, down at the bottom, that's this little option for showing the editing toolbar on the map. It is turned on by default, but you can change. If you would rather it to be at the bottom instead of the left-hand side, and maybe you want to make it a little bit larger, you can do that. Hit OK. Now you'll notice this at the very bottom. Right now, you can also turn this off as well. If you just use the checkbox to turn this off, you can also turn the toolbar off if you don't like it, and at that point it disappears. So it just depends on, it's a personal preference thing as to whether or not you want to use something like that. All right, so at this point I'm going to go ahead and start drawing or sketching in my new polygon. Now this is where that snapping becomes important. All right, I'm going to start my line here at the end, and I gotta turn snapping on real quick. So snapping's turned on at this point. Now you'll notice as I near the edge of that existing parcel that I get a piece of text that pops up, and my cursor automatically bumps over so that it intersects that existing corner of the parcel. That's where snapping comes into play. Right? And it ensures that the new vertex that I'm about to add is going to snap to that existing parcel so that I don't accidentally get a small gap or even overlap between those two parcels. At this point, I can use my mouse to click a point or vertex. And all I'm going to do here is just begin sketching in my new polygon. Right? So you're just defining points, creating a sketch. When you're done, you can simply double click. Right? At this point, I'll take it all the way over here. Now, there are better ways of doing this. I'm going to wind up with a gap here, but that's okay for this circumstance. So I can double click to finish this off. There is a gap there. Right? There are other tools that I could have used to kind of finish this out that would have ensured that I didn't get a gap, but I did in this case. All right, so at that point then, we have a new feature that's been added. Fills in that feature. So now at this point, the new addition, this new feature that I've created, is not currently a part of the underlying data set. So as you're making these edits, you're doing so in a sort of in memory, right? You're doing these as temporary features until you either manually save. You can see my save and discard buttons have now become active. So if I hit save here at this point, then it will commit that feature to the underlying data set. Or if I had turned on auto saving, right, and once I hit that auto save time limit, then it would save as well. But at this point, that feature is just being kind of held in memory until I either save it or discard it. Now, you may want to add some attributes for this feature as well. That can be done by going to the Attributes button on the Edit tab. And you'll see that with the Attributes pane will display any features that are currently selected. Right now, I just have that new feature that I've drawn in. It's my only selected feature. And then you can just simply begin typing in your new values. And you have an Apply button at the bottom. Of course, you can apply the changes. So this attributes pane is very handy for initiating attribute changes, either additions or updates as needed. Now keep in mind you have your undo and redo buttons at the top. So if I want to undo anything, it is keeping a list. So you can see that right now it says update, undo, update feature attribute. So if I click this, that's going to undo the attribute change that I made. And if I click it again, then it's going to take away the parcel that I've just drawn in. You can also redo if you need to, as needed. So that's just a high-level overview of creating new features. Of course, you have a lot of different tools that you can use in the creation process. I mean, we're just looking at this from a high-level, fairly easy point of view. Now, what if you want to modify features? Right? So if you want to modify or delete, for that matter, you are going to have a selection set to modify or delete your features. So in this case, I will create a selection set real quickly. Got 2 selected features. At this point, then I can click the Modify button, and that'll bring up the Modify Features pane. And what I have here is a set of tools that allow me to modify my selected features. Right, so for example, maybe I want to merge those polygons. Right, I could hit the Merge button and then merge the 2. Now the divider's gone between the 2. So you've got a whole set of tools. I'm going to undo that just to show you a few other things here. You might also want to split, right? So there's a split tool that will allow you to split interactively or by feature, just by drawing a line. You split your feature into 2. Other commonly used tools, right? There should be a vertices tool, edit vertices. And then you can make changes to the vertices as needed. You can select multiple vertices at a time. Draw them, drag them as needed. Of course, that doesn't make any sense what I'm doing here, but hopefully you get the idea. I'm just trying to kind of illustrate a few things here. So a lot of tools here. All of the tools that you see on the Modified Features pane are tools that are related to modifying an existing feature. Right? So it just depends on what you're trying to do. I've got a whole big set of tools here that allow me to modify features in a lot of different ways. Now you can also delete as well. To delete, you also need a selection set. And pretty simple, straightforward here. You just hit delete, yes, and the feature's gone. So pretty straightforward, right? So we've kind of gone over the editing process in ArcGIS Pro. Workflow is definitely different compared to ArcMap, but in a lot of ways, I think it's been simplified. And once you get used to this new workflow, I think you're going to really enjoy doing your edits. From a functionality perspective, the same tools you had in ArcMap should now be available on ArcGIS Pro, particularly with the newer versions of ArcGIS Pro. There was a time there where there was a gap between the editing tools that were in ArcMap and what we had available on ArcGIS Pro. That gap is essentially closed at this point. So for the most part, all the tools that are available on ArcMap should be available on ArcGIS Pro as well. So that's going to about cover it for this time. I appreciate you joining me, and we'll see you next time.